Hello, this is Rudayna Abdo with Urban Nibbles. Today, my guest is Monique MacKenzie, who is the Director of Planning at a Big Ten Higher Education Research Institute in the United States. Hello, Monique.
Hello, Rudayna.
Monique, the education sector has been dramatically impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, and the future of operations of higher education institutions is being heavily weighed, both in the immediate time frame as well as the long term. Can you tell us what you're doing differently now in the immediate aftermath?
Thanks, Rudayna. One of the primary activities we were engaged in right away since the onset of the pandemic here in the United States has been our budgeting. So our fiscal year turns at the end of June, and so we had a quick calculation of our losses, given that we had to evacuate our campus in March. We realized we were in the realm of about $30 million worth of losses. So as we have been preparing for our next fiscal year, we've thought very carefully about how to structure a budget that gives us a path for two contingency conditions. One is that students and campus be present on campus sometime in the fall of this year, 2020, and another that everyone would return to campus in person in January of 2021. And those two different scenarios have a radically different footprint on our budget and our operations, of course, but that's essentially what we've been working towards, is trying to imagine both not just the economics, but the operational changes we'll have to make in order to do that.
And is a large chunk of your revenue stream gone, given if the students don't come back to residence? Would that be a big hit on the operations without having the room and board aspect of student life?
Yes, it certainly is a significant impact to the operational budgets. If you think about how the university operations footprint is structured, the primary set of services that are generating revenue and supporting themselves based on that revenue is coming from housing and dining. Other supportive services, whether it's facilities maintenance, whether it's landscape grounds, it's really a minor component of the university operational budget. So changing the footprint and the activity pattern for those two things in particular, housing and dining, is a significant difference for an institution like the one I work for.
So if we were to go back with the first scenario of going back in the fall, presumably will there be measures in place? How will roommate situations work out? How are the public spaces navigated, and how would that be controlled? Do you have measures for these, or are there solutions at this point?
We haven't arrived at our final solutions relative to how we can maintain that distancing and that sort of best health conditions, if you will, in a pandemic situation. But we have had conversations about how we could manage. One of the first things, of course, is reduced occupancy, whether that's in a residence hall. So instead of, depending on the configuration and the layout of a particular residential room, reducing the number of people in that room, reducing the amount of shared space and shared facilities. We have quite an inventory of residence halls dating from about the 1950s through to the 2015s. So depending on their era, their design, and their layout, we have more or less flexibility. Dining also, we've had a number of conversations, a number of kind of scenarios, if you will, about how we could deliver food on campus and in the conditions that maintain as much as possible the distancing conditions. I have heard from colleagues at other institutions a lot of conversation about what are the quick builds, what are the quick plexiglass separators, what are the quick distancing kind of parameters that could be established in physical space that would help manage some of these conditions. At my institution, we really haven't implemented those yet because we are, I believe, targeting an early June decision about which scenario we feel best represents the future. And then I believe we'll see a pretty significant burst of activity driving towards either occupancy in the fall or occupancy in the winter.
And if this virus is here for a while, do you think that there will be seasonal differences in operations? For example, now here it's beautiful warm weather in a northern climate, so classrooms potentially moving outdoors. Do you think that there could be a scenario like that where the the students can return to campus in the warmer weather, having some outdoors, and depending on the ventilation systems within the buildings, is that a factor as well with the occupancy indoors or outdoors in operations?
Yes, it certainly will be a factor. I think what I see most likely in terms of how higher ed institutions like the one I'm at operate is thinking about that blended model between a digital learning experience and an in-person learning experience. And across the disciplines, what that means can vary widely. So simulation at the dentistry school or simulation in a physics class, of course, is quite different than maybe a language lab, is quite different than learning in a chem lab. So how our institution, which had been very effective at figuring out essentially peer learning or flipped classrooms, how we could set up a model where students are learning just as much from themselves as they are learning from the expert on the stage, if you will. Our institution has some experience and some success with that, but the next step, which is these modes of learning that are so different, is yet to be determined, and that will really be a push for the curriculum designers and for the leading faculty in those disciplines. In terms of, you know, which buildings are best occupied as their building systems kind of can support enough air exchange, if you will, right, to keep conditions as ideal as possible, I am less optimistic about how much change we can make to those buildings. And that's maybe particularly because of our footprint. We are about 23 million square feet on our flagship campus, 29 million square feet across our whole system. And most of our buildings, more than 50% of our buildings are 60 years old or older. And so the amount of capital required to even modify on a temporary basis some of those buildings is overwhelming to us, given the losses that we would expect, right, to continue if people aren't on campus, aren't present on campus. I think we will see some buildings where we could make some modifications, and it will depend on occupancy and activity in the buildings, but we will not across the board be taking on our portfolio in terms of renovations. So I'm less optimistic about that. I think it's more about the mode of delivery, the weather in our northern climate, which is quite harsh 4 months of the year, will be a factor, both in terms probably of how comfortable people are being around each other, and certainly how willing they are to be outdoors even in a shoulder season. But I see a little bit less prospect of that, given the tradition, if you will, of academic life, which is not to be present on campus at the most glorious times of the year.
True. Flipping lots of things at these times. Is there a diversion of the budget at this point for either short-term or long-term, or is it too soon to do long-term budgetary changes?
Right. Well, we have done short-term diversion, absolutely. And that was really because of the state of losses that were so abruptly realized on campus. Our losses were probably $30 million in the since the pandemic was declared and the stay-at-home order was issued. So yes, there were immediate needs to divert budgets. Our institution has some reserves, and reserves were able to cover this first initial loss that was experienced, you know, at the end of this fiscal year 20. What we see going forward in this modeling of our budget for the coming year, contingent again on what conditions look like on the ground, are some changes that are across the board directed at one of the primary spends that any higher ed institution frankly has, even an R1 institution like ours, where there's a huge chunk of activity coming from sponsored research. The first most significant expenditure we always have is in our salaries, and the second is in our space. And so to our salaries, we have instituted a freeze. For hiring, we have instituted a freeze in terms of the annual merit pay that is frequently distributed at the university. There have been voluntary salary reductions at the leadership level. We have also frozen tuition, which is not so much helpful to the expenditure. Sorry, it's a deficit on the revenue side, but it certainly is an important thing to do for our community as students consider their future at the campus. So we believe that our budgets are going to have to look at, in fact, our current instruction is a 3, 6, and 10-year horizon for reductions in our budgets. And we need to look at that because we believe that the operating requirements are going to be pressured to continue to reduce, to continue to shrink over that horizon, whether it's just recouping losses or whether it's because the institution itself will be reduced in terms of its physical place operations. That's the horizon that we're working in now.
If we look further afield, and well, first of all, what's your opinion on blended learning? Do you think this is going to trigger us to moving towards having blended learning more of a norm, even in larger institutions, established, more traditional institutions? And I guess related to that, and based on what you were just talking about, could that blended learning then attract a higher student body, which could supplement the tuition fees and budget?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea that those two things could be linked. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I mean, I think that blended learning is inevitable. I think it's inevitable for a lot of reasons. The pandemic renders it, in high contrast, because if it's not safe to be gathered in large groups, then here we are, right? Because I do believe that people will still have the appetite for the learning at that level, even if they don't have the appetite to be around others. And as I said, I think institutions, if you think about their business models, will be highly motivated to figure out effective, attractive, resourceful and rewarding blended learning, because that will keep the students coming, just as you're saying, Rudayna. So the people need to stay engaged. How they stay engaged on various platforms digitally is kind of the maybe $64,000 question that it's hard to discern that as well. But I think some of the most interesting work that's been done since the pandemic was declared, after the 6-alarm fire feeling from our IT, our information technology support folks, is going to be that. So working directly with faculty across disciplines to understand, what are the tools, what are the ways we can make this work, I think is a really important part of the future of any big institution. The sidebar, interesting article I read the other day is that some of, among US higher ed, which there are thousands of higher ed institutions, not all of them are research institutions, the largest proportion of institutions that are declaring in-person classes this fall are the smaller private liberal arts colleges. And I think that's just fascinating to me, because I think they understand clearly that their calling card or their appeal comes from that kind of face-to-face experience. But I think it's going to be quite a challenge, depending again on how health conditions look through the US, even in August, for those smaller institutions to really realize, the enrollment that they're projecting, and their hopes that the students will still come and have that unique 4-year undergraduate liberal arts experience.
Oh, interesting, because I was going to, my mind was going the other way with labs, having access to lab facilities and such, that this is where the research institutions are probably more robust, because you need those labs and you can't get them anywhere else. Right.
So, and I think, this is the unknown, but I think you might be able to have some digital lab simulations and demonstrations, but if I'm a student in a discipline that relies heavily on chemistry or research applications, physics, chemistry, biology, I don't want to spend my whole undergraduate career only doing labs by simulation. I would feel that I had missed something. Yeah. So one thing for us to think about, certain kinds of blended learning in the near term, but a whole academic career of online digital learning for those things that really need to be tangible and hands-on seems underwhelming.
Yeah. And given that we are going to be hitting a recession, and globally jobs are going to be hard to come by, there are a lot of thoughts that there's going to be an uptick in people going for continuing education, for broadening their skills. Is there a ray of hope there for the educational institutions, that they can attract a new segment of students, bring in new tuition, new streams of tuition, even if it's purely online? Is that something that's factoring into the planning as well?
I think so. I think I have certainly been reading from those who are following closely that the idea might be, if students can't have an in-person experience, they'll either choose a gap year or they'll choose an institution closer to home. And that may bring some benefits, whether it's a large or small institution. And so there's maybe some opportunity there. I'm not entirely sure what will eventually transpire with that, but there's certainly some possibilities there.
Okay. So we want to keep this brief and just touch on a couple of other things. What do you think we should take forward with us once we're out of this pandemic planning, once we're out of this mindset, when we can go back to operating with no restrictions? What do you think should move forward with us?
Well, that's a good question. I think, because I'm obviously very enamored of place, I do think that really when we are clear of the most unknown or the greatest threat, I hope that what we take forward with us is a clear understanding of how unique and beautiful and how oasis-like campuses can be in the milieu of their surrounding context. Because every campus really prides itself on its own unique identity, its own unique brand. It's a remarkable situation in any condition, but particularly in urban conditions, to dedicate so much land and development and activity, and very lively activity at many hours of the day, to this kind of common purpose of an institution. So I hope we recognize the value of the uniqueness of that going forward. One of the things that I've thought about recently, because pandemic conditions have laid bare so much of the economic disparities, is this idea about equity or access, participation really in higher ed. And digital learning might actually, especially if we can really advance the breadth and the depth of our digital learning offerings, can really offer opportunities to communities that are typically underrepresented. So the flexibility that comes from asynchronous learning, yes, there's always going to be an issue of the right technology, the software, the hardware, the broadband access. But if we can really create online learning that reaches a lot more people who typically would have economic troubles supporting loans to get to campus, schedule timing troubles because they're working as well as being a student, I think that'd be a remarkable thing going forward. So I really hope that the development of this digital learning platforms, and there'll be so many of them, could really bring opportunity that just isn't there. It doesn't work for the economics and the kind of life stage that many people find themselves at. Typically people of color, typically people who might be first generation students. So I think that would be a remarkable thing if we could take that on going forward.
And to ask the Philip question of that, the practices that we've done throughout planning and focusing here on the campus planning aspect, what should we leave behind once we don't have to be in this crisis reaction mindset? What should definitely be left behind and moved on with?
Well, it's a great question. I don't think it's a very popular opinion that I have.
Okay.
But I do think in North American context, higher ed institutions are very enamored of providing a remarkable set of experiences that are far beyond pure academics or even social development. So, you know, when you think about the origin of universities, or you think about most European non-North American universities, there's typically not a lot of capital or significant investment in assets, physical assets, buildings, et cetera, devoted towards housing students, feeding students, diverting students, whether it's a recreation center, a massive recreation complex, or even, frankly, athletics, facilities, events, teams, et cetera. So I certainly don't think that North American institutions are going to leave all those things to the side. That actually is part of what they perceive their appeal to be. But I do wonder, hope, I guess, aspire that maybe some of those conversations, at least going forward, would be influenced, right, by the amount of really sunk costs that's sitting out there, in the amount of facilities that get built, in the amount of annual expense. Yes, they generate revenue, but the commitment then that we take on year after year, it's a little bit of an industrial complex called student life and athletics on North American campuses. So I hope that we might have a chance to consider some of those investments going forward.
Very interesting, and I'm sure a very controversial perspective if you were to bring it to a bunch of footballers perhaps, but interesting, because I'm here in the Netherlands, And just my experience with on the schooling system, that you don't have, you don't have the athletic community, athletic life among students happens within the community, and it's not hosted at the school. So that was a new thing. And
well, and and I would just say that if we took down the idea of boundary between campus and city, the amount of facilities that are on campus to support a very large student body. I mean, we have 50,000 students enrolled at our institution, 33,000 of them are undergraduates. So if we're going to serve a population that big, we do need facilities, but then there's lots of duplication and there's lots of competition. And so we have duplicate stadiums and duplicate arenas and duplicate hockey rinks and duplicate parks. And I'm not saying you can make do with less necessarily. You have to account for the population's use of them. But the amount of duplication that is out there, if you took a sharp pencil to it, I think, to calculate would be quite astonishing. So yes, not a popular opinion, just my own.
Well, it's really good to end on a controversial note. So thank you very much, Monique, for that. I really enjoyed your perspective and looking forward to keeping the conversation going as well.
Very much so. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.